The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch UK Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. You're listening to Paranormal Concept right here on Parasearch UK Radio with your host, Paul Rook.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of the Paranormal Concept Show. I'm your host, Paul Rook, and tonight we've got an absolutely fantastic subject for you all tonight. It's going to be amazing. I'm joined tonight by Kerry Greenaway. Hello, Kerry.
Hello, lovey, all right?
Yeah, how you doing?
Full Essex mode on, yeah, I'm fine. I'm full Essex mode.
Oh, dear. So have you had a good week?
Not too bad, thank you. Yeah, not too bad at all. It's been, so far, so good, is all I can say. Got attacked by a goose the other day. That was fun. Then nearly got run over by a car, but hey.
All in the same hour?
All in the same. Well, I was on my way to work, so it takes me 20 minutes to walk to work, and this all happened in 20 minutes.
Was it a talking goose?
No.
No?
Just your normal standard Canadian goose.
Okay. On holiday, yeah?
No, we have a lake where I live. There's a lake in the middle of the island.
The Canadian goose is on
holiday. It sounds so posh, doesn't it? I have a lake in the middle of the island. And there's like swans and geese and ducks and pretty other kind of seagulls and stuff. And I walk past these geese every single day, but just decided to take a dislike to me on this particular one. I was like, oh my God, I am like so cursed today.
It could only happen to you.
Honestly.
Well, mind you, we was talking about curses last week, so.
Exactly. Maybe I got cursed somewhere along the way.
Yeah, that's what the goose said anyway.
He went, she's looking a bit ropey today, let's have her.
Yeah.
And then as I walked out onto the main road, my fault. I hold my hands up to this, completely my fault. I didn't look properly. I didn't do my green cross code. Stepped out thinking there wasn't a car there. And then this car literally appeared from nowhere, screeched to a halt. I don't know who was more shocked, me or the poor driver of the car. I just was like, oh, I'm sorry, as you do. Ran across the road and they just drove off. Normally I'd expect a verbal beating. Yeah. I didn't get anything. I was like,
especially in Canvey.
I know.
Yeah. Well, at least you're okay. That's the main thing.
But I'm all okay, and nothing got hurt in the process. Didn't have goose for dinner, although that was close. And I would like to just say the rest of the day passed pretty uneventfully. So, whew.
Lucky for you. Anyway, I hope you've done lots of research for tonight.
Well, what a big subject you picked. Here's all I can say.
I know. 3-hour special. Here we come.
We are going to find it, though, I swear to God. I've been travelling the world for you this week.
Have you? So what have you found out then?
All sorts of stuff.
Have you found out where it is? The lost city of Atlantis.
I found out lots of possibilities.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about some of those possibilities.
Okay, well, let's talk about where the myth very first started, I think, is probably a good starting place.
Start at the beginning, it's always best.
Exactly, because I do not think this place actually existed. I think this is purely something that has evolved into a story, and the story was written by a guy called Plato.
Yep.
Who's Plato, Paul?
That's what I found out.
Who is he? Come on, tell me about Plato then. This is going to be a bit like tennis tonight.
He was a ancient philosopher type dude.
Mm.
Yeah,
he was an ancient philosopher type dude.
Really hip and cool.
Cool. Okay. He studied under Socrates and the teacher Aristotle, and he looked at lots and lots of different areas, like politics, philosophy, theology, cosmology, mathematics. Oh gosh, he was so well learned. But he used to write these dialogues, they were called, which are basically stories, to help put his teachings across to like the masses, as it were. And one of those stories, it has Atlantis in it.
It did.
So that's where this myth of Atlantis very, very first started.
Yep, and I actually watched a documentary today on the Atlantis, and they actually, it was on a National Geographic TV show, and they said that Plato has been the only person that's documented any possible evidence that the place has ever existed.
Yeah, see, I question that statement. I do question that statement. Possible evidence. He could have just made it up. It's like I could make up a thing. And 2,300 years later, they're still searching for it, and it never existed.
Well, there is always that possibility. I'll give you that. However,
conceded 1 point to Kerry. Just say.
He does mention the Pillars of Hercules and the Rock of Gibraltar as being the gateway to Atlantis. Now, who's to say that there wasn't a big island just on the other side of where the Strait of Gibraltar is that got washed away? Because, let's face it, I mean, islands come and go, especially small volcanic islands come and go over the centuries. So who's to say it wasn't one of those? Well,
the thing is, you do actually have to have a look at the time he was living in, because it was incredibly, there was so much seismic activity going around the Mediterranean in particular at that time. There was huge, there was so much of big earthquakes that were affecting the landscape. So that is a possibility. But we all know that you go out into the Atlantic, there are big land masses, America for one, Africa for another.
Well,
they're quite big. Yeah. And if you technically, although they're big, they're surrounded by water.
Well, that's true, but I think they're too far.
No, that's a stretch, everybody.
Yeah, I think they're a bit too far away for the description.
See, I think that too. When I was reading up about it, I do think that as well. But when you start looking at some of the references, which we'll do in a bit, as we argue this point, I really do think that it is a stretch. But when you look at the descriptions, there are links. There are links, and people have seriously researched it. So I don't know. Who knows is all we can say.
Absolutely, and I was on this documentary that I was watching earlier. They looked at some satellite images of a place called Doñana in southern Spain, which is mostly marshland.
Yeah,
and they could pick out quite distinctive circular patterns in the ground. Mm-hmm. And they believe that could be a major port that would coincide with the descriptions of Plato from what Atlantis would have looked like. So, they're looking at this particular piece of ground, and they also looked at the ground under the water. They'd done a radar thing, and they picked up square buildings under the water just off the coast. So they're thinking that that's a possible link to Atlantis.
Well, that's true. That's true. But I don't think it's a strong enough link, because I think it's just a story. I mean, in this dialogue, because they're more dialogues, it's like it was really difficult to pin it down to what Plato had actually written it, because it's not like it's like people having conversations. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It's like in this particular case, if I remember rightly, It's, oh gosh, what were their names? I've got it written down somewhere. Critias and Tyrannius or something their names were. And then another guy called Sultan comes into it, or Soton or Sotan or Satan. No, it wasn't Satan. That's a different show. And that's where the major descriptions have come from in regards to, you know, what it looked like, where it was, what it was all about. But when you start looking at the whole picture of things like the volcanic activity in the area and some of the disasters that befell some of the islands in that area, the civil unrest in regards to the political situation, you can also see where that story would have come from as well. So it's almost like if you sat down and then wrote I'm going to say story or a dialogue between people as if it actually had happened, a bit like War of the Worlds, you know, kind of thing. People might take that as a factual account when in actual fact it isn't real, it's just a story. So people will then go, okay, well, we'll look at all these facts that are written in this dialogue and then try and make it match. And everywhere they've looked at, there's no definitive, perfect fit. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that's the problem I have with this. When you start looking, that's where I go into, I think it is purely a story based on lots of different elements that Plato's pulled together to make this story. Maybe a bit of a myth and a bit of a legend thrown in there that was bandied around at the time as well, and has come up with this beautiful land of Atlantis when in actual fact it never existed. It's just a lot of different elements that are pulled together, and that makes it sound so credible. He's like joined all the dots, a bit like the Dan Brown books, you know, where a lot of people take the Dan Brown books as fact, like the Da Vinci Code and stuff like that, because you can follow, he's pulled together like loads of different elements and come up with a really good story. But the story is fiction, even though he's got a lot of fact in there. He's just joined a lot of dots together to make it fit. And I think that's what Plato's done with this. So I don't actually believe that I'd love to say that Atlantis existed and we'll find it one day, but I really don't think we will.
So when you say, when you think about Atlantis, what do you think about it? Do you think that Atlantis was like a massive place that was technology advanced? Like in some of these fabled stories say that they were quite advanced for their years, or do you think of it as more of a fishing village or a port or something?
No, I see it quite large going on over the years. I mean, this is from my imagination, what I sort of like have built up Atlantis to be in my head, and from the little knowledge I've got from reading about it a little bit. I think it was quite a large civilization. I don't think it was small at all, but I just see it as something really extraordinary. I mean, it was supposed to be, the main city was supposed to be circular with concentrical like bands going through to the middle, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and there were supposed to be gods and demigods living there, which straight away my skepticism takes a leap.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was supposed to have things that they didn't have. You know, I mean, one of the descriptions of this city is absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah.
You know,
I think of it more of a trading port or post.
I mean, apparently it was very trading and very war. They loved their war, didn't they?
Yeah.
But it was supposed to be like a place of richness and with beautiful gardens and, you know, just a complete utopia is used an awful lot in regards to Atlantis, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, again, this documentary said that in Doñana, southern Spain, it had links to mines, which they could get gold, silver, copper from, and it was a big trading port, basically. So my thinking would be that is what is described as Atlantis. So maybe they just called that port Atlantis, or it was just penned, if that, that it was sort of a legendary place, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand. I understand what you're thinking, but there are so many of those kind of ports around the Mediterranean area, and it's a well-known geological fact with the seismic activity that they've had that it is rich in minerals. So that it could be anywhere. You could take any port, mining area or whatever, in the Mediterranean and say exactly the same thing about it.
So, they're also looking at another site in this documentary called Murcia off the Greek island. It was on the Greek islands, and they were obviously looking at some of the descriptions from Plato to this new place that they've discovered on the island, and it said that. Plato described it as worshipping the bull. And on this island in Murcia, they have big pictures on the wall of bulls. And that it was obvious from all their drawings and stuff that they worshipped the bull. The only thing that put them off, as it were, that this was a site for Atlantis, is the fact that the description by Plato was that it was swallowed up by water, where this island, the Murcia, they have evidence that it was a thriving town. Then it got destroyed very much like Pompeii by a volcanic eruption, and then they came back and built again on top of the existing.
This sounds like Santorini, because this sounds very similar to what happened on Santorini. Now, that used to be called Thera, not Murcia, and it had a huge Minoan civilization on there, who, Minoans, the Minotaur, worshipped the bull.
Yeah.
Now, that disappeared suddenly around the same time as a huge volcanic eruption. So again, you've got that duality, you've got that common thread, as it were.
Yeah,
going on.
And
it's not the only island in Greece that this is sort of, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, wiped out the civilization. I mean, Santorini is still there now, isn't it? People go there on holiday.
Exactly.
So they did go back and rebuild.
So I mean that wouldn't have wiped. I mean, as described, it wiped out the Atlanteans, where obviously this volcanic eruption didn't, because obviously they built back on it again. So that sort of rules that location out for being a site for Atlantis.
True. But there was an island called Atlantis.
Yep.
That was around the same time. Now, this is all during the Peloponnesian Wars. Again, civil unrest, loads going on, loads of death because they had huge epidemics at the time. Then they had this huge earthquake that basically caused lots of damage to buildings, loads of dead people. And then following that, there was a tsunami. Now, the effects of this were felt up to 100 kilometres away, so that far that a Spartan army camped at that distance had to go home because of this earthquake. But this island of Atlantis, because of this big seismic activity and the fact of the tsunami, suffered major damage and loads of warships were destroyed. Warships, mooring place and all this. The tsunami actually literally wiped the island clean. I mean, it was like a complete wipeout on this island.
Yep.
And they didn't rebuild. It disappeared.
This is why I think Atlantis did exist. Maybe it was known by a different name and it was just the legend that arose was Atlantis. But I do think it was a proper town or proper city. I do believe that it was a trading post or point for many ships and stuff, and I think it was destroyed by a tsunami, because that's the only explanation that I can think of, rather than being just swallowed up
It
by the sea.
It is a logical assumption that, particularly, as I say, if you look at the particular area at the time and you take all the factors on it and you bring them all together with the political unrest, the major trading that was going around in that area at the time, the mineralogy of the area, when you start looking at it, you can build up the picture. But I still go back to, we pulled a lot of factors together. Tsunamis were wiping out civilizations. Earthquakes were causing major disruption to civilizations. I mean, it's a little coincidental, do you not think, that the island that literally got completely wiped away was called Atlantis? Do you know what I mean? It's so close to Atlantis.
Yeah, but then things get twisted, doesn't it?
Exactly my point.
Every story there's always an element of truth. So, yeah, I mean, why not? Why could there not have been a town that had a similar name to Atlantis, maybe, and just over the time, Chinese whispers, and it's turned into Atlantis?
That's why I think his dialogue is being taken far too much as read, and people aren't looking at the bigger picture. They're looking for this fabled land. I mean, Richard has just put in the chat room that the idea of Atlantis was technically advanced is relatively a new add-on. And this came about towards the end of the 19th and early 20th century with the rise of the Theosophical Society and the New Age movement. So if they were like quite a rich town, trading port, I suppose you want to call it, and showed that wealth against a normal little trading post fishing village, they probably did look, if they existed, they probably did look something special, something fantastic. Do you know what I mean? But again, I mean, I go back to the actual story itself. When you start reading snippets, haven't read the whole thing, just saying, when you start reading the description that this place was supposed to have, from the dialogues, it does sound fantastical. It really does. And whenever something sounds quite fantastical like this, you kind of go with no proof to back it up with. I mean, going back to that little island that got wiped out in the seismic activity following tsunami, literally took everything off the island and basically submerged it. Yeah. That particular island, they fished extensively and done geological surveys off of it. The only thing they've ever found is a part of a statue of Poseidon.
Yep.
Yeah. And that's it. Now, if that place was Atlantis, based on Atlantis, surely with the stuff that's been said about Atlantis, they'd have found a lot more.
Yeah, and this is why I said about the Spanish off the coast of Dinana. They've radared the bottom of the water just off the coast, and they've found walls to buildings and smaller buildings dotted around. So it's obvious that there was some sort of settlement there. So I think, and it is literally situated just off the Rock of Gibraltar and the Strait of Gibraltar. So it's a big trading post sitting exactly where Plato described a big city. So I think, if anything, that's where it is.
I think that was no, I don't disagree. I think there probably was a settlement where they're saying. My argument there is I don't believe that's the alleged Atlantis. I really don't. Because when you look at the description, it's like supposed to be circular, so surely that would have shown up on Geophys.
Yeah, but they've picked up on circular images on the ground, suggesting that is the centre of Atlantis. So it was supposed
to have aqueducts with bridges to these circles.
I don't remember them saying. I don't think they've found that, but I didn't Can't remember, to be fair.
There were palaces.
Yeah, they found big rooms. They found what they describe as palaces, but it could just be, I don't know, a big colossal, I don't know, amphitheatre or something. It could be anything. That we're only speculating that that's what it is.
Well, of course. I mean, that is the problem, isn't it? I mean, the guy. The problem is with this. In this dialogue, it explains what this place looked like quite in depth, which is why everybody thinks it's a real place, because it does explain it in quite in depth. I mean, it really has got a decent description. I mean, it's even down to alleged sizes of this place. I mean, they talk about it in regards to Stadia.
Yeah.
I mean, put it this way, this is just one thing, the length of a canal. And this is in the dialogue, right? Beginning from the sea, they bored a canal of 300 feet in width and 100 feet in depth, and 50 stadia, which is 5.7 miles in length, which they carried through to the outermost zone, making a passage from the sea up to this, which became a harbour, and leaving an opening sufficient to enable the largest vessels to ingress.
Yeah.
That is like one of the passages in regards to what Atlantis is supposed to be. That's not small. That's pretty huge.
That's
and I'm
massive.
sure Geoff that's just one canal.
Yeah. I mean,
That's just one canal.
They didn't obviously go into dimensions of this circular thing they found, but it does look a bit like what they mapped Atlantis to look like, with all the circular rings and stuff. Now, unless they find a little man holding a placard, "Welcome to Atlantis," they're not. They're just gonna basically be clutching at straws that is Atlantis.
I think they've looked at so many areas, haven't they?
Yeah.
They've looked at so many areas and gone, I mean, we're concentrating on the Mediterranean area, mainly because some of the areas that we found that they think could possibly be Atlantis, we both, Paul and myself, were looking at it going, that's like across the entire Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
It's not close at all. And we're going right back in the day, aren't we? What time period are we looking at here?
We're looking at, I think, BC. But then you're looking at the Roman period as well, aren't you? Because a lot of images that come from Atlantis are all Roman in design, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's like, well, the dates of Plato, he was born in 428 BC. Yeah. So if you look at, that's when he was allegedly born. I say allegedly because I found conflicting reports, because I also found he died in 348 BC, and I was thinking, how does that work? I'm not quite sure how that calendar works, whether or not they go up or down. It could be that it's like the countdown to BC and it goes up after AC. I don't know. I was getting all confused with my dates. But he was born around 428 BC. So who knows? Do you know what I mean? There's a lot of speculation on what they did and what they didn't do. No. What is definitely known is there was a huge explosion, a bit like the Industrial Revolution going on at that time.
Yeah.
Huge concepts were being, thought about and, looked at. I mean, you look at some of the work that has been done by those three people. We still know them today: Plato, Socrates, Aristotle.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Those three people we still, are still referred to. Today, they were like pioneers of their time in regards to how they thought and how they viewed the world. And that is, for sure, one thing in regards to this. And I sort of look at this era a little confused as to where they got some of these concepts from with the limited technology they had back then. And look at it, it's almost like, as I say, that explosion of industrial revolution that we had, post-Victorian, early Victorian, Edwardian, or whenever that industrial revolution time happened. because there's a huge melting pot of huge concepts and huge ideas and, civilizations taking that next step forward. And I do think that he was very, very good at pulling lots of different. He may well have visited a city that had I can't even say that word, concentrical circles that was, almost like a better race than some of the other civilizations he'd seen around the Mediterranean at that time, and I still think he pulled lots of concepts together to make a fantastic story. But when you read certain bits of the story, it's very specific, very specific. I mean, as I say, some of the things that they've looked at are so far away from where, the rest of it is supposed to have happened. It's like, he talks about the Rock of Gibraltar and the Pillars of Hercules, and then is the Atlantic Ocean. And then you think, could they have traversed the ocean? Could they have?
Well, they do talk about the edge of the known continent in this documentary, and they only do literally go as far as Spain. They've got all that sort of Europe part covered and North Africa and stuff, so that seems to be where all the trade goes through, the Mediterranean Sea and stuff. So they don't actually go into the Atlantic Ocean other than to get to Spain. This is why I think that you'd go through the Rock of Gibraltar and then head north to Doñana, which is on the southern coast of Spain, which is where I think is what they now describe as Atlantis. It just ties in. It just, as I said, it just ties in and makes sense. From the satellite images, you've got the rings that exist. Well, are said to exist on Atlantis, and it's got mines there that they've had like a rich supply of minerals, from gold, silver, and copper. I think that it's very plausible that could be the site of Atlantis. Whether or not it was actually called Atlantis, we'll never know. As I said.
No, but we also do know that Plato did visit Egypt and was hugely knowledgeable about Egyptology. So we know he went into that continent.
Yeah. So but in that case, then he could have got to Spain as well.
Well, I don't think that's without. I don't think that's without a doubt. He was well travelled. This guy. Do you know this guy?
This dude.
This dude. Yeah, he's a traveller. But as I say, he went into Egypt. So why couldn't it have been North America? It could
even be another trading site for the Egyptians. So
I mean, when you actually start looking at the culture of Egypt, I mean, that's quite a thing, isn't it?
Do you know what?
I think the pyramids and stuff.
I do actually think the Egyptians are related in some way to the Atlanteans, because I mean, let's face it, they were quite advanced in their years as well, with the technology that they had to make the pyramids.
Oh, well, that's a whole subject, isn't it?
Exactly.
That's a whole different subject of who built the pyramids. I mean, that's, again, another thing that's rumbled on for years, isn't it?
So, again, this is another theory that, I mean, when I done my parapsychology course, they were talking about Atlantis being situated in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And they had a lot of similarities to the Egyptians. Now, it could also explain how the Mayans and the Incas also have pyramids, which also are guided by the stars. So, was it that the Atlanteans had that information, and as they spread out across the equator, they shared their information? There you go. How about that one?
I'm not even getting into that. I mean, there is one thing I would like to say, that the story of the dialogue that is about where the Atlantis tale comes from is actually preceded by another dialogue, which is the story of regarding a sun god, and he's called the sun god Phaethon, yoking horses to his father's chariot and then driving them through the sky and scorching the earth, which does remind you very much of an Egypt tale of Ra, isn't it? Chasing the scarab is pushing the sun across the sky. It's that, oh my God, I don't know the exact story, but when I read that bit, I suddenly thought, oh, I can sort of see where he's pulled that from his time in Egypt.
But then the Spanish,
into,
I suppose most civilizations would have worshipped the sun and the moon. But again, I think Spanish tends to do that as well a lot.
I mean, one thing that is said about Atlantis is it was supposed to have biannual crops, so it'd have a decent crop twice a year. Now, the only places that happens is in, warm climates that you get a biannual crop. And I don't know enough about crops and growing to pinpoint that down to a specific zone in the world, but that would narrow the band, wouldn't it? So it sort of automatically discounts the Antarctic one, not the North Pole one. And because there's some really far out ones, wasn't there? That we found.
I think that sort of puts Atlanta at least close to the equator.
It's got to, because if it has got at least that one little factor of a biannual crop, which makes it so, that's quite a thing for food, isn't it? Having two crops a year. That's quite a big resource just there. Forget the gems and everything, but just having two crops a year in a time where it's probably quite difficult food-wise for people, which, again, would make it seem a lot richer because it's got plenty of food, it does sort of like put it in you must be able to narrow the band of where it is in the world where they have biannual crops, surely.
Yeah, I would have thought it had, and putting it on the equator, or as I said, southern Spain is the ideal place, especially with.
You're so stuck on Spain. I love it.
I am.
I went around the world
believe
with this, and you got stuck in Spain on a beach with a cocktail, going, "Yeah, I reckon it's there because the sheriff is."
No, I do. I think that is pretty much where it is because of the descriptions. You got the Plato descriptions, and then some of these things that this documentary come up with, it does strongly suggest that that's where it is. And because Plato described it as being swallowed by the sea, it rules out volcanic eruption because obviously it's nothing to do with the sea. But you've got the tsunami, and it would be in an ideal place to be washed away by a tsunami.
Not necessarily. I mean, if you want to look at Mesopotamia, I mean, it fits the description. And there was supposed to have been, don't forget, the plane.
Well, but I think that's too far away.
No, well, it may have been. It may not have been. I don't know. I mean, next week we're talking about the Knights Templar, aren't we?
Yeah.
And you told me they travelled the world.
Well, yeah, they did.
So maybe they did have that, ability to traverse the world. Or the ocean, should I say.
That's a possibility. You can't rule it out,
another point conceded to Kerry.
No, not at all.
I mean, you look at major rivers like the Indus, the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Nile. I mean, they're all important trade routes and good for transportation and ships and stuff like that. All helped with the advancement of all the civilized in that area. I mean, the mountains surrounding Atlantis and the plain, there was supposed to be like this rectangular plain that was surrounded by water within Atlantis. Now, they were supposed to be rich in resources, ranging from metals to timber, so there's got to have been woods. Now, the mountains around the Mesopotamia they fit it.
Yeah.
So when you start looking at geological signatures, I suppose, or signposts, I think is the word, there are more places than Spain that fit it in a better kind of way.
Yeah. But I don't know. I mean, even
Did you just
even
say
if you
yeah? Can I take that as another point?
no, you can't. I think, you know, a perfect place for it would be literally slap bang in the middle of the Atlantic Sea, because it,
What, like a halfway point? You mean
yeah,
between the Mediterranean and the Americas?
yeah, because then that way when they spread out, that they're in a prime location, aren't they, to spread out both directions, east and west, and share their information.
Well, this is
It
true.
would explain then how the Incas, the Mayans, the Egyptians were all along that centre line,
But haven't they geophysed?
but there's similar.
I'm sure they've geophysed it all, and there's no link, or there's nothing. They've not found any for a landmass that size to fit the dimensions of what's written in Plato's dialogue. There's no evidence at all in the Atlantic Ocean, and they've done whatever, you know,
See, I don't know.
imagery or whatever it is that they've done.
Yeah, I think it would have been satellite image rather than geophys the Atlantic Ocean, because that's a quite big deal. That would be, and very costly, I would have thought.
Well, there's satellites all around the world, aren't there? So I don't know what they can do and what they can't do these days. I mean, you know.
I mean, they could have radared the bottom, but then I don't know how effective that would be.
I don't know. I honestly don't know how the extent of it. I know I read somewhere that they're pretty sure that a landmass that size to house somewhere with the dimensions that are in Plato's account, there isn't any. It would have showed up, and they haven't found any evidence at all in the oceans. Having said that, look how long it. Mind you, I know this is like a lot difference in size. It took them ages to find the Titanic, didn't it?
It did. But
so, and because it's pretty deep.
Oh, absolutely. And I
So
don't
you
know.
can't go paddling.
Yeah, I don't know that whether they would be able to find a big landmass under the ocean because of the sheer depth of it. But I still think that you're looking. I think you'd really be better off looking on the land to find it, because although it's been described as being washed away or swallowed by the sea, we're going back back in the day when they don't have the technology we've got today. So we see a tsunami, they would just see it as being swallowed up by the sea. So if this place were literally just washed off the face of the earth, you know, the description's going to be, well, you know, we see it swallowed up by the sea. In actual fact, it was just washed away.
Yeah.
So that's sort of where I'm thinking.
A bit like what happened on the island of Atlantis.
Yeah.
And similar to really what happened with Santorini, with the Minoans.
Yeah, indeed. And that's what I'm sort of going along with. So I mean, I just think of it as a trading post or trading port of sorts. It was a grand port because obviously it would have needed to be in a prime location to deal with, you know, Europe, or whether it traded with the world. We don't know. But yeah, I mean, the prime site would be in just outside the Rock of Gibraltar.
But there is one thing that the saga does say, or the dialogue does say, and it says an island greater in extent than Libya and Asia, afterwards sunk by an earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the ocean. That's pretty big.
That's massive.
That's pretty big.
Yeah, indeed.
I mean, basically, what that's suggesting is sediment from the sunken continent blocked all passage beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. Yet there's no signs that sediment ever created a barrier preventing ships from sailing between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. So it's got to be a corruption of something. It's got to have been something that didn't really happen. It's something, I mean, there's another thing as well. Now, the guy Solon in this dialogue describes the city as being formed of a circular mountain in which the god Poseidon excavated 3 concentric channels of water. Really? Poseidon?
Yeah.
So when you start looking at things like that are said in the dialogue, which is what a lot of these people work from, yeah, I mean, I know Richard has, come up with an alternative, even though Plato is credited with the first accounts of Atlantis, the modern view does come from the 1800s, from the writings of an American politician author, Ignatius Donnelly. Sounds like something out of Harry Potter.
It does.
In his book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, says it's a good read, by the way. This has been rumbling on for years, longer than that time, and all the accounts have been taken from Plato. All the archaeological findings that we've been looked at have all gone off of the writings of Plato.
That's right, and I think what they've done, they've just basically taken the writings of Plato, looked at the evidence, and trying to piece it together using logical reason, and obviously
that's why I think it
fails.
That's why I think it fails.
But when it comes to the gods and all the Poseidon stuff, I think this is why
the Poseidon stuff. Don't
the
careful.
Poseidon stuff.
Don't want to be upsetting Poseidon. I live right by the sea. Remember?
Okay, that's fine. No, I just think that also then gives rise to some of these more weird and wacky theories out there, like the whole aliens.
Oh my God! No, don't you start bringing aliens into topic.
Stargate Atlantis and all that sort of stuff. It's very, I know it's very far fetched and stuff. It's but no, I'm quite convinced that it is just off of the Rock of Gibraltar in the Atlantic Sea. There, that's what I believe it to be. Where it's definitely there. I think, and hopefully one day they will actually find it. But whether or not it's called Atlantis or whether or not it's called something else, we'll never know. It's just gone forever, I think.
Well, obviously it's gone forever, But I did look into the seismic activity that was going on around at that time. I went that kind of route. We research so differently, don't we, darling?
We do, yeah. I watch documentaries and so
I do the reading.
You do the reading. I wait for the film to come out.
We'll be doing a show on the massive earthquake of San Francisco soon, and referring to that movie with The Rock in it. What's his name?
Yeah, there's supposed to be a sequel of that as well. So.
Oh my God.
Anyway.
Anyway, back to seismic activity. Now, and this is historical seismologists. I love that the earthquakes that were happening around that time, they weren't little. These are ferocious earthquakes that were happening an awful lot. There was lots of wars, the political unrest regarding on that. I mean, there were massive fights going on between the Spartans and Athens.
Yep.
While that was going on, a huge earthquake killed 20,000 Spartans. When they refused the aid of the Athenians, it caused a huge uprising of the populace, and that lasted for years and years and years. Following that, we then enter the Peloponnesian Wars. There were massive epidemics going on, huge earthquake, major damage, major death, massive tsunami. That must have been big to be felt 100 kilometres away for an army to go, sod this, we're going home.
Yeah.
That tsunami also wiped out the island of Atlantis.
Yep.
So these are not little. This is what I'm saying. He was living in this sort over their recent history, bearing in mind when he lived, that relatively recent history is filled with earthquakes, epidemics, civilizations being wiped out and taken into the sea, loads of myths and legends about gods and upsetting the gods and don't do this and don't do that because you've got to appease the gods, otherwise they're going to wipe your civilization out. You know, there was massive trade routes going on coming through from Egypt. He was a huge Egyptologist, so you've got a lot of those myths and legends coming through from that and influences going on. You've got, do you see what I mean? It's like a huge melting pot, purely. And then if you do have a little, I say little, if you do have a sizable city that is quite a rich city in comparison to some of the others that does get wiped out, just purely coincidental. He looks at the island of Atlantis. It's not a huge leap to assume that he just tweaked the name and made it Atlantis, and then he writes it as a story. So it's just, to me, this is a Dan Brown scenario. This is taking a lot of different facts, putting them together in one story as almost like as a fable or a teaching tale. To people.
Equally, though, he could be writing about a city that was wiped away in this tsunami,
which
and
happened.
Just change the name to Atlantis.
You just repeated what I said, so that's another point to me. I think I'm on 5 points now. But you can find that around the world. I mean, I was starting to look into other places that might possibly be Atlantis. And I read a few stories. They were far too far away and small, far too small, and no other link other than the fact that it got swallowed by the sea, quite frankly. So I didn't really look too in depth into that. But around, you know, when you start looking around the world, there's many, many civilizations that have had this kind of situation happen where somebody's upset a god, i.e. Poseidon in this case, but any old god would do, and a disaster then happens to befall at that particular time, and then the civilization or the place gets swallowed by the sea. But when you've got this amount of huge seismic activity going on, and a huge tsunami hits, we saw the devastation in 2001, was that, or 11?
I can't remember. I know what you mean, though.
Yeah. That place. I can't even remember where it was.
Sri Lanka, wasn't it?
Yeah, or that area. When you saw the devastation that caused with our modern buildings, do you know what I mean? With modern tech, you know, what we use building materials now. Going back, yes, they were using like bricks and stuff like that, but their mortars weren't as strong, and there was a lot of wood buildings as much as there were the temples for the gods and stuff. I mean, you go to Rome, some of those buildings are still standing, but you can still see the devastation that earthquakes have caused those buildings.
Oh, indeed.
You know, the ancient buildings I'm talking about, not modern.
But, I mean,
buildings.
Romans were very God-driven anyway.
That whole period, weren't it?
Yeah, I mean,
the Greeks were just as bad.
Yeah, I was going to say the Greeks had the similar sort of thing as well. Now, they never had a word for volcano until Pompeii, but they still said that it was like the fire god, or you know, or the earth god, or whatever god it was that they didn't appease.
Yeah, God.
Just
we're well up on our gods tonight, aren't we?
Well, I don't know what particular god they said it was, like the volcano, but you know
it's in Doctor Who.
Yeah. That was aliens. But I just think that, you know, because they were very God driven, that they would have that they could have said that you didn't appease Poseidon, so that he wiped you from the city, you know. But they didn't have. They might not have had a word for tsunami. They might have never seen one before, as the case with the volcano. Well,
they may have seen it before, but they just saw it because it was so rare.
Yeah.
Relatively rare, even though they've got the huge seismic activities. It could be like hundreds of, a couple of 100 years in between each occasion, as it were, of these huge tsunamis, which is quite relative, modern history, as it were. It's a bit like the war for us. We still remember that distinctly, but it was like 100 years ago. You know what I mean? And so it's not a regular occurrence, but it does happen. It's like, well, they really upset the gods, so you can, from a primitive belief system structure, a big event like that, without knowing the knowledge we have now from a scientific point of view, even though you had these great minds working, they still didn't have the technology to truly understand it. I do think from their perspective, it would be easy to go, yeah, you've upset the gods, they upset the gods. I mean, the Atlantis was supposed to have a grove that was purely for Poseidon. They worship Poseidon. So to then have by a wave, you understand how that leap is, can't you?
Yeah, indeed.
That leap of assumption with knowledge that they had at the time. I mean, we're quite blessed. The trouble is, I think this is a problem we have all around any kind of we view things today. You kind of forget what they were trying to work with, I suppose is the expression, back then. I mean, come 2,300 years in the future, we're looking back at us and go, God, what, they had such a limited, compared to 2,300 years time, we just don't know. That's just basic. They didn't have the understanding of planets and movements. They lived very much by the seasons and myth, legends, and this, this understanding of concepts regarding philosophy and cosmology. These were very brand new ideas.
Indeed,
when you start looking at what Socrates was doing and Aristotle and Plato were doing, light years out of their time. The layman who was working the fishing port is not going to understand or know. Probably thinks these three guys were crazy.
Yeah, I'd go with that.
It's a bit like the Newtons and when you look back at Isaac Newton and some of the concepts he was coming out with, people thought it was bonkers, but look where that got us.
Indeed. Look what he's done.
Yeah, and look what he did.
Yeah,
and Einstein, and even people like today, Stephen Hawking. Some of the concepts he comes out, we all sit there and go, what?
Yeah.
How did you even think of that? But in, I don't know, a couple of 100 years' time, we could be going back going, blimey.
We found it.
We've proved it. Not just found it, we've proved it.
Yeah.
And we live today in a completely different way because of a concept he just thought of. It fascinates me, but I don't think Atlantis is real. I think this is a lovely old-time Dan Brown kind of scenario. That's where I go with this.
See, and I think it existed, but it possibly would have been known as another name.
Well, hopefully one day we will know for definite.
Fingers crossed.
They will find that signpost saying, "Here lies Atlantis."
That's it, yeah. Atlantis FC. And on that note, we have come to the end of the show. Hope you've enjoyed it. Kerry, what's coming up for the following week?
Okie dokes. Well, tomorrow night is Wednesday. We have our double bubble. We have the Supernatural Chat Show with Sean Cadman kicking off at 8 p.m. He has got John Blackburn in the studio. Honestly, I'm going to start charging John Blackburn rent, I think. But he's talking a little bit more with John about his journey through his time in the world of the paranormal. Followed by Penny G. Morgan. She's got a Haunted History Show. She's talking about the cage this week. Talking of which, I need to reply to a message. Sent me a message. Do you want to go investigate the cage, Paul?
I've been there. I'll leave that one to you.
You don't want to go?
No, I've been there.
Fine, just me and Penny then, by the looks of it. Yeah, excellent.
Cool.
On Thursday night, we have the Spectral Zone with yourself and the lovely Kaz Rooney in the studio. Now, you're looking at some of the more bizarre, not so well-known cases about poltergeists.
I know, I'm looking forward to it.
It's always the Enfield haunting, always 30 East Drive. But this week, poltergeist, you're looking at some of the more bizarre cases on that one, some of the lesser-known ones, which is always interesting to have a look at. Now, on Friday evening, the Dark Mirror Show with myself and with Kaz and Mark, of course, Now, he can't possibly, well, I know he's going to because it's Irish folklore. He's going to go into precursors and aliens and sticks that glow like lightsabers, I'm sure. I've told him specifically some of the legends I want him to look at, but he'll ignore me as always. So it's Irish folklore on the Dark Mirror show on Friday. Then on Sunday, I have the beautifully amazing, wonderful Andy Horner in the studio with me, and we are talking about dealing with mental health spiritually.
Awesome.
I know. So we've got a great lineup of shows again this week for you guys.
And I think for next week's show, we have Norman Fay on talking about the Knights Templar.
Oh, brilliant. Brilliant.
Interesting. I'm really looking forward to that one. So fingers crossed he can make it.
Yeah, that would be awesome because that means I don't have to do quite so much research.
Yeah.
We better do it just in case, though.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Well, on that note, I just want to thank everyone in the chat room. I think that's just Richard.
Yeah, tonight, yeah.
I think, everyone else is in bed.
Oh, they're watching football or something going on. There must be something going on tonight.
Exactly. Yeah. I think there is an FA Cup thing on tonight or something, but the football's just rubbish. So I'd rather be here.
Same here. I'm with you, darling. Can't stand football.
Absolutely. So on that note, thank you everybody, and speak to you all again very soon next week. Goodbye, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.